People who travel to developing nations and go into rural communities there often describe, to their surprise, how happy the people seem to be there despite their relative poverty. And that gives them fresh eyes into look at their own community back home and say, by contrast, how unhappy we here in Australia seem to be despite our relative prosperity. That seems to be borne out by recent data too. The Australian Bureau of Statistics last week released their mental health and well-being survey that showed some quite alarming statistics, one of which was that a third of all young adult men and half of all young adult women reported experiencing mental ill health in the past year. Now, there are very real reasons why people experience mental ill health with both medical and social causes, and these things need to be taken very seriously. But there's something perhaps wrong not with the individuals, but with us as a culture, as a society, when a whole half of a given cohort report being mentally ill. That is really quite extraordinary and says there is something we need to actually look at in our culture. And perhaps it is what Jesus challenges us with in today's gospel, in the parable of the man who builds the bigger barns. Now, in the parable, the problem is not that the man has a good harvest. That's what we'd want for every farmer. But rather the problem is that the man then stores all his goods and decides to rely on his wealth for security. And in the parable, God says, well, no, look, you'll die this very night. Your wealth does not bring you security. And so Jesus challenges us that wealth does not bring security or happiness. And that really, I think, it starts to make sense of what we see happening in our own culture. There's another contrast between rich and poor nations, which also might be a clue to this, and that is that poorer nations tend to have much higher levels of religiosity, faith and spirituality, whether that religion is Christian or Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist or something else. By and large, poorer nations, poorer people tend to be much more religious, whilst we here in Australia and other developed nations have much lower levels of religiosity and faith. Again, the data is out on this, with the last year's census showing that now 40% of all Australians report having no religion at all, let alone those who report a religion with different levels of adherence. So there seems to be some correlation, maybe we can't prove causation, but a correlation between poorer people and poorer nations who report high levels of religiosity and high levels of happiness. And by contrast, we here in Australia, who have high levels of prosperity, but also high levels of mental distress, or low levels of happiness, with low levels of religion. So there seems to be something going on there. And I want to present this message this weekend, particularly because we had our families beginning their children's journey for the sacrament of confirmation. And for so many young families, I think the beginning of the sacramental program is a re-entry point into the church. We know for many young families, there are busy early years of buying a house, of getting careers established, of having children. But by the time the kids are in school and now in year 3, there's usually a sense of settledness in which I think becomes a real opportunity to invite families to re-engage their own faith commitment and their commitment to the church. And so the 5 weeks of the confirmation program and the weeks down the track for each of the sacraments and the preparation become wonderful opportunities to invite these families back. So what I said to the families was that what you are doing by choosing to share faith with your child, to have your child confirmed, is both countercultural, because fewer and fewer people in Australia do this, but it's also vitally important for your child's future well-being. Because faith and spirituality are such a buttress against the currents in our society which cause such mental ill health. Currents of wealth and expectation, of consumerism, of self-esteem based on appearances. These things we know contributes to ill health. But faith is such a buttress against those things. Because it doesn't mean that Christians and Catholics don't get depressed and don't get anxious. Yes, we do as well. But for us, there is something to cling to even in our darkest times, and the bottom of the abyss is not quite so far down. Because we know that we are made by a loving God and in God's image that gives an esteem and a dignity that comes from God, not from external circumstances. We know that we are called by Jesus to live a certain way that makes a difference, and so we have purpose in the world. And we know that we have the Spirit who fills us and comes into us and can fill the very deepest, emptiest parts of our hearts and minds. And it's important that we teach our children these things well so they can cling to them. So even the times where we don't feel them, because in the depths of anxiety or depression, it's very hard to feel anything good. But if we can hold to these truths, it gives us something to lean on to help us to get through the darker times. And so for those families who are beginning this faith journey with their children, I just want to affirm that what they are doing, what you perhaps watching this are doing, is of such immense value for your child's future happiness, their well-being, their resilience, because faith and spirituality does help to give this. And so we as a church community, and I personally, want to support you prayerfully and practically in your journey of being able to share faith with your children, and hopefully on the way you might reinvigorate and rekindle your own faith as well.